You know, George H.W. Bush only had a single term in the White House, but man, was it one of the most consequential of the modern era. I mean, think about it. In just 4 short years, he's staring down the end of the Cold War, he's commanding one of the biggest military coalitions in history, and he signs a civil rights law that completely changed the face of American society. It's a lot. So yeah, let's get into it. And this, right here, is the central puzzle of his presidency. The year is 1990, and you've got these two totally different legacies being built at the exact same time. On one hand, you have this massive global projection of military power, and on the other, a really profound act of domestic justice. So, how on earth did these two defining and kind of contradictory moments happen side by side? So here's our game plan for unpacking all this. We're going to start by looking at those two legacies, putting them right next to each other. Then we'll dig into that incredible civil rights battle that was won at home before we pivot to the massive military coalition that was being built abroad. We'll cover the ridiculously fast 100-hour war. We'll break down the whole grand vision of a new world order that came out of it. And then finally, we're going to try to make sense of the really complicated legacy all this stuff left behind. All right, let's jump right in. The Bush presidency, it really is this fascinating story of two completely different kinds of wins. They're totally different in scale, in scope. One was all about championing human rights for Americans here at home, and the other was about projecting American military force onto the world stage. Okay, so just look at this comparison for a second. In one corner, you've got the Gulf War, right? An international crisis, a response to a foreign invasion that took a global military coalition to handle. And in the other corner, from the exact same year, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was a law designed to tear down decades of discrimination against 43 million of our fellow citizens. Just two massive, massive challenges, and they were tackled with two completely different parts of the presidential toolkit. So let's start here on the home front. Because long before the world was glued to the news about Kuwait, a very different kind of wall was being torn down right here in America. And that was the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And to really get why this law was such a game changer, you have to start with this number, 43 million. Back in 1990, that's how many Americans were living with some form of disability. And they faced legal, totally routine discrimination. I mean, in trying to get a job, finding an apartment, or even just walking into a store. This wasn't some small issue. It was a daily reality for a huge chunk of the population. And when President Bush signed it into law, he used this incredibly powerful image. This wasn't just about making a few small changes. He was talking about demolishing a wall of exclusion that had literally locked millions of people out of everyday life. He even called it a new Declaration of Independence for people with disabilities. That's how big a deal this was. So what did it actually do? Well, the big things are it outlawed discrimination in the workplace. It made it so public places, stores, hotels, theaters, had to be accessible. It totally overhauled public transportation and even required phone companies to provide services for people who were hearing and speech impaired. This didn't just tweak a law, it fundamentally reshaped the physical and social landscape of the entire country. Okay, now let's pivot. Because just 7 days after Bush signed the ADA into law, on August 2nd, 1990, the whole world shifted on its axis. Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army storms into its tiny, oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. And just like that, overnight, this one act of aggression becomes the defining crisis of the Bush presidency. And the response was just incredibly fast. Bush, remember, he'd been a UN ambassador and the director of the CIA, so he got on the phones in what people later called telephone diplomacy. By August 5th, he'd already drawn that famous line in the sand saying this will not stand. And what came next was just a masterclass in building a coalition. He got over 30 nations on board, including, and this is pretty amazing, the Soviet Union. And it all led to a UN resolution authorizing all necessary means to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. The UN deadline was January 15th, 1991. That deadline came and went. Saddam didn't move. So diplomacy was over, and the military operation we know as Desert Storm began. It kicked off with a massive air campaign, but it was the ground war that came next that was just mind-blowing. 100 hours. That's it. That's all it took. After weeks of bombing from the air, the actual ground war to free Kuwait was over in just 4 days. It was an unbelievably swift, decisive, and just overwhelming victory for the international coalition. The speed of it was just shocking. But then, right at the moment of this total victory, came a really pivotal and, frankly, super controversial choice. The coalition stopped. They didn't push on to Baghdad to get rid of Saddam Hussein.
Bush's reasoning, as he explained it later, was that it would have turned them into an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land. That single decision to stop the advance would echo for decades to come. So, in the aftermath of the war, everyone's feeling pretty euphoric, the Cold War is also ending, and President Bush starts talking about this sweeping new vision for how the world should work. He called it a new world order. So what exactly was this new world order? Well, as he described it to Congress, it was this vision of a world where the United Nations, finally free from all that Cold War gridlock, could actually work the way it was designed to. A world where international law, not just who had the biggest army, would guide what nations did. It was a really optimistic, hopeful idea for a new era.
But, how did that vision actually stack up against reality? Well, almost right away, critics started pointing out some pretty deep contradictions. The vision was all about respecting international law, but the reality was that the U.S. had a history of going it alone when it wanted to. The vision was for a stronger UN, but a lot of people argued it was too often just used as a tool for U.S. foreign policy. And the vision talked about disarmament, all while the U.S. was still the world's biggest military spender and arms dealer.
So when you pull it all together, what you're left with is this really complicated picture. In the exact same moment in time, the same president pulled off a landmark victory for civil rights here at home and led this undeniable military victory abroad. Both were seen as huge wins, but both of them left behind a whole trail of tough, lasting questions. And that brings us to the final question I want to leave you with. You've got this domestic triumph, right, built on inclusion and empathy, and then you have a foreign triumph achieved through overwhelming force. Two huge legacies, born from completely different philosophies. Which one do you think had the more lasting impact? Not just on America, but on the world. Which one really defines that era?